Hello friends, today I'm going to demonstrate your supplier registration process. So there are two ways through which you can do the registration process or to initiate the registration process. One is through the external registration process and second is internal registration process. Now let's understand what is external and what is internal. For the external registration process, the buying organization provides a supplier registration URL to the potential suppliers. And this URL you can find in configure procurement business function, which I'll show you in a short while. For the internal registration request, users can navigate from the supplier sourcings or self-service procurement work areas and submit the registration request on behalf of the supplier. So you can initiate internal request and then it needs to go through an approval process. And once it is approved, they become your authorized spend supplier basically. Yeah. So you need to come to setup and maintenance, and if you select the procurement offerings, come to purchasing, procurement foundation, sorry, and configure procurement business function. You can set this business unit, and once you have clicked on this one, you'll find the setting basically where you can set about your business unit. And this setup is business unit specific basically, where you are going to be setting up your payment terms, your price breakup types, whether you want approval as a three-way matching process or receipt close point is received, conversion rates, currency, etc., etc. And here you're going to find a URL which is going to be for prospective supplier registration URL and spend authorized supplier registration URL. This you can provide it to your supplier for external registration process. Okay. For internal, you have to raise it through here. Supplier, you can initiate the supplier request. Yep, register the supplier and that becomes your internal request. It goes through an approval process, and once it is approved, the supplier is going to be active and you can execute the transactions against that supplier. Okay. Important setup you'll find in functional area suppliers, which is configure supplier registration and profile change request. If you see, there are two tabs: supplier registration and supplier profile change request. Now let's understand supplier registration. So when you're creating a registration process, these are the attributes which are going to be important, or is going to be enabled, or is going to be mandatory before you create the supplier record. Now if you're trying to create a prospective supplier, now you can see all these attributes like organization details are required, contact details are required. So if contacts is required actually for prospective supplier, address might not be required for prospective supplier, but address is going to be required for spend authorized supplier. So when you're trying to convert from prospective to spend authorized, yes, address is going to be required from, because we are going to be creating a site against that particular address. Similarly, bank account, initially bank account might not be required, but yes, when you are creating the spend authorized, you might require, I'm going to change it to spend authorized to yes. So I might require bank account before I create a supplier. Now the second tab is exactly the same thing, but there are a few more attributes which is going to be required when you're trying to change the supplier record. And this will come into effect only when you are changing the existing supplier record. Okay, now move on to the approval management, how the suppliers are going to be approved. So how you're going to be setting up supplier spend authorization approval rule. There are two workflows, one for internal supplier registration process, and the second one is supplier spend authorization approval. That means if you are creating an internal request, there is an approval process for that. And at the time of converting the internal request into a potential supplier or spend authorized supplier, then this is going to be the approval process which is going to be used. And the third one is only when you're changing the supplier profile, basically. So whenever you're changing anything, it might require, let's say if you want that need to go through the approval process, then you can configure this particular approval process. Otherwise, I'm just setting up this supplier spend authorization, which is a straightforward one. So there are two stages, first stage and second stage. We have just configured the first stage, and I'm trying to keep it very, very simple. So if you see, like, I've created a rule, and this rule says you can give the name of the rule, you can put the priority of that rule, and you can say rule always applies. That means this rule will always be getting executed, basically. Coming back to action, I can say approval required, I can say automatic, or I can say information only. So there are three options. If I'm saying automatic, then it will be automatically approved. It won't go through any approval process. But moment I'm saying approval required, it will show me it will ask me the approval group or single approver whom it needs to go to, basically. Now, since I've created an approval group as supplier approval group, so I've just created approval group and added like 2 members. The notification will be available to both the users. If I'm saying single approval, it will ask me for the role, whether it needs to go to a worker, it needs to go to a supplier managers. So anyone who has got supplier managers role, that's going to, so that notification is going to notification is going to be assigned to him, and he should be able to approve. Similarly, supplier administrator. Here I'm selecting the approval group, which is supplier approval group, where the 2 members are myself and Cassie Brown. Okay, so this is where exactly you are going to be setting up your approval process. And now we'll create a supplier and see the whole process now. In order to create a supplier, we have to come to procurement, click on suppliers. You can create suppliers, and this is going to be an internal request. Basically, I can register the supplier directly as well, actually. And instead of going to the prospective and prospective, I can straight away set to spend authorized. Okay, but the process remains the same. So if I'm setting up to prospective, it will fire off one process, approval process. Once it is approved, you can change that prospective supplier to a spend authorized at any given point of time. Once it is spend authorized, then only you'll be able to raise your purchase order against that supplier or payable invoices against that supplier. Yeah. Request for reason, saying new supplier source. You can select your business unit. It's optional, but you can select your business unit if you want. Spend authorized, and you can select your corporation website. This is going to be important because we have set this text number, registration number as mandatory. That's the reason. RBL. Let me put the proper one. Okay, you have to put, because we have said like the context is going to be mandatory, so I'm just going to put the context as mandatory. Address is going to be mandatory as well. So I'm just going to say ordering and remit to, so I can make a payment. We'll try to register now. We'll see what error remit case gives us. Okay, can you see this? Earlier the bank account was not mandatory, but I've set this to mandatory, and because of this it's giving me this error message. And for business classification as well actually, so I need to enter business classification. Bank account I'm going to select. Right. So we have created a supplier, a registration supplier, which is called, and I'll refresh it. ABC Construction Company. Okay. So so this has gone for an approval, and I need to log in as different person because I cannot approve myself because I've submitted, so I cannot. I've created a supplier, so I cannot approve. Someone else has to approve it. So approve and approve. I'm just going to approve this one as well. There will be another notification for that supplier, and it has gone back actually saying request to approve supplier ABC Construction Company for spend. I'm going to approve this as well actually. Okay, so once it has been approved, you should be able to query the supplier and see the status. Once it is spend authorized, is approved, you should be able to transact. So manage supplier ABC Construction Company spend authorized. That means it has been registered, it has been spend authorized, it has been approved. So now you can do the transactions. Okay, this active status. Okay, and the rest of the information can fall in place actually later on as soon as you get, like, if you want to enable withholding tax, if you want to assign withholding tax group against this supplier, you can change the payment methods. Yeah, so those things can change which won't have any impact, but this is the process of the supplier registration. Okay. A very important aspect I would like to take up is supplier side and supplier side assignments. Supplier side, in if you understand from the definition, it establishes the relationship between your procurement BU and the supplier. So when you're doing the transaction, you are not only selecting the supplier, but you're selecting the supplier site as well. Actually, that's a mandatory configuration. So a procurement BU represents a specific purchasing or a source organization that will be responsible for maintaining and establishing the relationship between the supplier. And you can set the terms and the policies on this supplier site. Now, coming back to the supply site assignment, now a site can be assigned to multiple BU in a centralized procurement environment. So, take an example. My procurement BU is A, and my other business units are A, B, C. So, all A, B, and C they can do the transaction on this particular site. Though this is owned by procurement BU A, but still I can do the transaction for B and C as well, actually. But establishing the relationship or communication to the supplier on behalf of client B and C is going to be done by procurement BU. Okay, let's deep dive into this functionality. Right. You need to have an address, so you need to create address first, and this is the address which I've created. I'll quickly show it to you. So you have to give the name to the address because that's going to be reference when you're creating the site. You need to put the proper country, basically where exactly the supplier is registered. Uh, Address line 1, ordering, remit to, RFQ, whether this address is going to be used for ordering, this site address is going to be used for remit to or RFQ or bidding process. And there are quite few main attributes which you need to set, basically whether this address is going to be used for the withholding tax, tax registration, classification, whether the allowed tax applicability, basically, so whether the tax is going to be allowed on this address or not. And yeah, so once you have created the address, you need to come to site. Now, what is site? Site is nothing but it's a relationship between your procurement BU and the supplier. So when you're creating the site, first of all, it will ask you which procurement BU this site belongs to, right? So once you have captured, I'll just quickly show it to you, like when I'm pressing the create button. So when you're selecting the create button, it will ask you, that's a mandatory field. You have to select which this site belongs to which procurement BU. Now I'm not going to create a new one. Let's check this one. So this site belongs to procurement BU Pepco Poland PLC. And then it will ask you for the address name. So the address which we have created, that's going to be referenced over here. So you need not need to like retyping the whole address. And on the right hand side, if you see, there are quite few check boxes like purchasing, whether this site is going to be used for the purchasing or pay or making a payment. Now you can have two different sites, one for the purchasing and one for the payment as well, actually, right? But in this particular case, I have got only one site which can be used for the purchasing and the pay and the payment. And site is very important. It's a mandatory field, mandatory configuration actually. Without site, you cannot create any transaction. When you are selecting the supplier, the second most mandatory field it will ask you for the site, whether it's a build to site or a ship to site. Okay, so these are the setups actually which you have to configure: purchasing, receiving. So all these receiving setups. So what will happen is there is a generic setup on the receiving side, receiving parameters, and you can override those configuration uh, by putting those configuration at the site level. So take an example, I might have early receipt tolerance for 10 days, but only for specific to this particular supplier and a site, I can override my early receipt tolerance in days, basically. Okay, and now comes site assignment. Now, site assignment is nothing but it's you have procurement BU, and you can have um, you're assigning this particular site to the client BU. So when I'm using in other words, the client BU or any other business unit should be able to access this site in order to make the transaction. So I can, on the left hand side, I can auto create assignment. That means it will pull out all the business units, or I can manually keep creating the client BU and assign this to procurement BU basically. So that means this client BU, and this is mandatory because Pepco Poland is PLC and the client BU is also PLC. This setup is required, but if you want to add another BU which is going to be making use of this side, you need to select this. Now I might not have the client BU right now. I do not have client BU, but you can have multiple business units which can access to this particular site. And on the right hand side, you can do the configuration about what will be my liability distribution, because each BU might have different balancing segments. So you can enter your liability distribution, prepayment distribution, bill payment distribution set, etc. And also it my withholding tax can be applicable to a specific client BU. So it can be applicable to client BU A, but it might not be applicable to client BU B. So even that can be configured over here basically. Usually this setup is required when you have a centralized procurement. So you can leverage this functionality of assigning this side to multiple BU so that they can do the transaction. Okay. Hope you liked my session. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe to my channel. Thank you.